It was supposed to be our reset, the moment we finally exhaled after a year of grinding ourselves down to nothing. My girlfriend Clara and I had been working opposite schedules, living like two ghosts passing in a hallway. So for our third anniversary, we pooled our savings and rented a cabin. Not just any cabin. This was the one you see on aspirational Instagram feeds. An A-frame design, all glass on one side, nestled deep in a mountain range so remote the listing boasted about its digital detox potential, a euphemism for zero cell service. The final stretch to get there was a 10-mile dirt road, a jarring, rattling journey that felt like the world was shaking itself loose, shedding civilization with every bump. The cabin sat at the very end of that road, a solitary sentinel overlooking a valley cloaked in ancient pines. The owner, a disembodied voice over a crackling landline, had given us the code to the lockbox and one simple instruction. The generator can be finicky. Just give it a good kick if it sputters. Enjoy the peace. Peace. That first evening, it was absolute. We sat on the deck, a bottle of wine between us, watching the sun bleed across the sky, setting the distant peaks on fire. The silence was so profound it had weight, pressing in on us, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the trees. It was perfect. We made love, ate a simple dinner, and fell asleep, tangled in each other, the vast, star-dusted Wyoming sky our only witness through the wall of glass. I woke up to the sound of tapping. It was rhythmic, insistent. Tap, tap, tap. I blinked, my mind fuzzy with sleep. It was coming from the glass wall that made up the entire front of the cabin. I nudged Clara. "Did you hear that?" She mumbled, swatting my hand away. I sat up, peering into the inky blackness. The moon was a sliver, offering no real light. The forest was a solid wall of impenetrable shadow. Tap, tap, tap. It was sharper this time, more deliberate, like a fingernail against the pane. My heart started a low, heavy drum against my ribs. Who would be out here? We were miles from anyone. I slipped out of bed, my feet cold on the polished concrete floor. I crept towards the glass, my breath fogging a small circle in front of me. I couldn't see anything. Probably just a branch, I whispered to myself, trying to convince the frantic animal part of my brain. I stood there for a long time, listening. The tapping stopped. The silence rushed back in, thicker than before. I finally convinced myself it was nothing and crawled back into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin. But sleep wouldn't come. I lay there, every nerve ending buzzing, staring into the dark. Hours later, just as the first hint of gray dawn was softening the edges of the night, a new sound began. It was a low, guttural humming. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a vibration I felt in my teeth, in my bones. Clara stirred beside me, her eyes fluttering open. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice tight with fear. The humming grew louder, a deep, resonant thrum that made the glass wall tremble slightly. And then we saw it. Out in the pre-dawn gloom, a light. It wasn't a flashlight beam or a car's headlights. It was a soft, pulsating glow, hovering amongst the trees about 100 yards from the cabin. It moved slowly, weaving between the thick trunks of the pines, its light casting long, dancing shadows that twisted and writhed like living things. The humming was synchronized with the light's pulsation. As the glow brightened, the hum intensified. As it dimmed, the sound softened. We were frozen, clutching each other under the thin duvet, watching this silent, terrifying ballet unfold. Then the light began to move towards the cabin. It wasn't fast, but it was steady, unwavering. The humming grew so loud it felt like it was inside my skull, a physical pressure that made my vision swim. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. "The landline," I croaked, my throat dry. "We have to call someone." Clara just shook her head, her eyes wide with terror, fixed on the approaching light. It was maybe 50 yards away now. We could see that the light wasn't just a ball of energy. It seemed to be emanating from something, a tall, slender figure that was almost impossible to make out in the gloom. The humming stopped. The silence that followed was a physical blow. The light winked out. For a heart-stopping moment, there was nothing but the oppressive dark. Then every single floodlight on the exterior of the cabin, lights we hadn't even known existed, snapped on at once, bathing the entire area in a brilliant, sterile white light. And standing right at the edge of the woods, where the light had vanished, was a man. He was just standing there, motionless, staring at the cabin, at us. He was dressed in what looked like old, worn-out work clothes, but his face was wrong. It was pale, impossibly smooth, and his eyes were just dark pits, voids in the stark white light. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stared. We were completely exposed, framed by the huge glass window like specimens in a display case. He knew we were watching him. Then, slowly, he raised a hand, and he tapped on the air. Tap, 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 the exact same rhythm I had heard against the glass. It was him. He'd been right outside, his face pressed to the window, watching us sleep. My blood ran cold. The generator sputtered. The floodlights flickered, died, and then the cabin was plunged back into darkness. We screamed, a raw primal sound of pure terror. We scrambled out of bed, fumbling in the dark, tripping over our own feet. We didn't have a plan. There was nowhere to run. The front door was on that glass wall. The only other exit was a small bathroom window. We could hear him moving now, a heavy shuffling sound on the wooden deck. He was at the door. We heard the handle rattle, gently at first, then with increasing violence. We backed away, stumbling into the small kitchenette area, grabbing the heaviest things we could find, a cast-iron skillet, a thick ceramic mug. The rattling stopped. A new sound started. Scratching. A slow, deliberate scraping against the glass, like something sharp being dragged across the surface. It moved from the door, along the window, a sound that grated on my nerves until I wanted to claw my own ears out. I looked at Clara, her face a pale mask of horror in the gloom. This was it. This was how it ended. The scratching stopped directly in front of us. There was a soft thud against the glass and then another. And then we heard a voice, a dry, rasping whisper that seemed to come from right beside us. Let me see you. I am a skeptic by nature, a firm believer that for every ghost story, there is a rational explanation. Faulty wiring, the house settling, an overactive imagination fueled by too much pizza before bed. My friends and I, a group of 5, decided to rent a large, historic house in the countryside for a week-long reunion. It was a beautiful place, a sprawling Victorian with a wraparound porch, turrets, and enough rooms that we each had our own. The owner had left a note. The house has character. She creaks and groans a bit, but she's solid. Please respect her history. We laughed it off. Character was exactly what we were looking for. The first couple of days were idyllic. We hiked, we cooked elaborate meals, we stayed up late playing board games and catching up. The house did creak, of course. Doors would occasionally swing slowly shut on their own, which we attributed to drafts. We'd hear faint footsteps from the floor above, but with 5 people in a large house, it was easy to assume it was just one of us. On the 3rd night, things shifted. Mark, who was staying in the room at the end of the upstairs hall, came down for breakfast looking pale. He said he'd had a bizarre dream. In the dream, he was awake in his bed, unable to move, while a tall, gaunt man in a dark suit stood in the corner of his room just watching him. The man didn't do anything, but Mark said the feeling of malevolence was so strong it was suffocating. We told him he'd probably just had a touch of sleep paralysis. That evening, we were all in the living room when we heard a crash from the kitchen. We ran in to find a single plate, one of the house's antique china plates that had been sitting in a display rack on the wall, shattered on the floor. The rack was secure. The wall hadn't shaken. It was just one plate, almost as if it had been picked up and thrown down. A chill went through the room. "Okay," said my friend Sarah. "That was weird." Later that night, I was the last one to go to bed. I was walking up the grand central staircase when I felt it, a sudden, intense drop in temperature. The air grew so cold my breath plumed in front of me. And then I heard it, a woman's soft weeping coming from the top of the stairs. It was so clear, so filled with sorrow, that for a moment I forgot to be scared and just felt a wave of pity. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" The weeping stopped instantly. I stood frozen on the stairs, my hand gripping the banister, listening to the pounding of my own heart in the sudden silence. I forced myself to walk up the rest of the way. The hallway was empty. All the bedroom doors were closed. The next day, no one would admit to crying. The atmosphere in the house had changed. The playful creaks and groans now felt sinister. We started moving around in pairs, unnerved by the heavy silence and the feeling of being constantly watched. On the fifth night, the activity escalated dramatically. We were playing cards when every light in the house went out simultaneously. We were plunged into absolute darkness. Someone screamed. We fumbled for our phones, their flashlight beams cutting shaky circles in the blackness. That's when the noise started upstairs. It sounded like furniture being dragged across the floor, heavy and violent. Then came the banging, rhythmic and loud against the floor right above our heads. It was coming from Mark's room, the one at the end of the hall. We all yelled for him, but there was no answer. Terrified he was in trouble, three of us, armed with a fireplace poker and a heavy candlestick, crept up the stairs. The banging stopped the moment my foot touched the top step. The hallway was silent. Mark's door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, shining my phone light inside. The room was a wreck. The heavy oak bed had been dragged to the center of the room. The chair was overturned. The closet door was wide open, and Mark was gone. We searched the entire house, our calls growing more frantic. He wasn't there. We checked outside. His car was still in the driveway. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. We called the police, who arrived and treated us like hysterical kids. They searched the grounds and found nothing. They suggested he'd probably just gone for a walk to clear his head. But we knew. We knew something in that house had taken him. We spent the rest of the night huddled together in the living room, too scared to sleep, jumping at every sound. Just before dawn, we heard the front door creak open. We all spun around, our hearts in our throats. It was Mark. He was standing in the doorway, his clothes disheveled and covered in dirt and leaves. His face was blank, his eyes unfocused. He walked past us without a word, went straight up the stairs, and closed his bedroom door. We followed him, calling his name, but he wouldn't answer. The door was locked. We didn't see him again until it was time to leave. He packed his bags in silence and got in his car. As we were all about to drive away, I went to his window. "Mark, what happened?" "Where were you?" He finally looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a terror so profound it made me recoil. He just whispered, "He told me to be quiet." He never spoke of it again, and our group of friends was never the same. We all know what we experienced in that house. A place with more than just character, a place with a history that was still very much alive. I grew up in a house that was perpetually sad. It wasn't ugly or run down. It was a simple two-story home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. But from the moment we moved in when I was 5, I felt a pervasive melancholy that clung to the walls like damp. My bedroom was at the top of the stairs, and across the hall was a small, unused room that my parents used for storage. From my earliest memories, I refused to have my bedroom door closed at night. I had this irrational fear that if it was closed, I wouldn't be able to hear him. I called him the crying man. I never saw him, not clearly, but I would wake up in the dead of night to the sound of a man sobbing. It wasn't loud. It was a quiet, heartbroken sound that seemed to come from inside the storage room. I would lie in my bed, rigid with fear, listening to this unseen man's grief. Sometimes I would hear soft footsteps pacing back and forth in the hallway between our rooms. My parents dismissed it as nightmares. "It's just the house settling," my dad would say, ruffling my hair. "Old houses make funny noises." But I knew it wasn't the house. This was different. This was sorrow given sound and form. As I got older, things started to happen that were harder to explain away. Toys in my room would be moved overnight. I'd leave my stuffed animals arranged on my bed, and in the morning they would all be on the floor, facing the door. One night I woke up and the storage room door, which was always kept firmly shut, was wide open. A sliver of moonlight from the hallway window cut into the room, illuminating dusty boxes and old furniture. And in that sliver of light, I saw the silhouette of a man standing in the middle of the room, his head bowed. I squeezed my eyes shut, my heart hammering. When I dared to look again, he was gone. I told my parents, my voice shaking, but they just sighed and told me I needed to stop reading scary stories. They put a new latch on the storage room door. The next morning, it was open again. The crying continued almost every night. The footsteps became more frequent. Sometimes I would feel a cold spot in my room, a pocket of icy air that would drift past my bed. My friends didn't like sleeping over. My best friend, Jessica, stayed once and woke up screaming. claiming a man had been standing over her bed, watching her sleep. She never stayed the night again. The worst incident happened when I was 13. I was home alone one afternoon, watching TV in the living room. Suddenly, I heard a loud crash from upstairs. It sounded like a piece of heavy furniture had been thrown against a wall. I crept up the stairs, my heart in my throat. The sound had come from the storage room. The door was, as usual, slightly ajar. I pushed it open, and what I saw made me freeze. A heavy wooden dresser that had always been against the far wall was now in the middle of the room, lying on its side. Its drawers were pulled out, their contents spilled across the floor. And on the wall where the dresser used to be, words were scratched into the plaster. They looked fresh. I read them, my blood turning to ice. "Where is she?" I ran out of the house and didn't go back inside until my parents came home. I showed them the room, the message on the wall. For the first time, I saw fear in their eyes. They couldn't explain this away. My dad patched and painted over the wall the next day. He put a deadbolt on the storage room door. For a while, things were quiet. The crying stopped. The footsteps ceased. I started to think that maybe, whatever it was, had finally left. We lived in relative peace for 2 years. Then, when I was 15, my dad found an old box of documents in the attic while looking for Christmas decorations. Inside was the original deed to the house and newspaper clippings from the 1950s. He sat me and my mom down at the kitchen table, his face grim. The articles told the story of the family who had built the house. A man, his wife, and their young daughter. One day, the wife had taken their daughter and simply disappeared. The man, heartbroken and driven mad with grief, searched for them for years. He never left the house, convinced they would one day return. He died in the house, alone. The authorities ruled his death was from a broken heart. His name was Arthur, and the last thing he was heard saying by a neighbor was, "Where is she?" The night after my dad told me the story, I woke up. The house was silent. The deadbolt on the storage room door had been thrown. The door was wide open. And from within, I heard the soft, heartbroken sobs of the crying man, who was still waiting for his family to come home. We moved out 6 months later. There's a place in rural Wisconsin, not far from where I grew up, that the locals call Apostles Grove. It's not on any map. To get there, you have to know the right series of unmarked dirt roads that branch off the county highway. The grove itself is a strange clearing in the middle of a dense, dark forest. In the center of the clearing stand 12 ancient, gnarled oak trees arranged in a near-perfect circle. A 13th, much larger oak stands in the very middle. There are no headstones, no markers, but everyone knows it's a graveyard. The legend says it was a burial ground for a small, isolated sect that settled in the area in the late 1800s. They were ostracized by the nearby towns for their strange beliefs, and they buried their own dead here, one under each of the 12 oaks. The leader, they say, is buried under the big one in the middle. The rules for visiting Apostles Grove are simple and passed down through generations. You don't go there at night. You don't take anything from the grove. And you never ever touch the center tree. When I was 16, like most reckless teenagers in my town, I decided to break all those rules. My 2 friends, Ryan and Tom, and I were bored on a hot summer night, fueled by cheap beer and a sense of invincibility. We piled into Ryan's beat-up truck and headed for the grove. The air grew cooler and heavier as we got deeper into the woods. By the time we reached the clearing, the moon was high, casting long, skeletal shadows from the trees. The place was unnervingly silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just the sound of our own breathing. We walked into the circle of trees. The sense of being watched was immediate and overwhelming. It felt like we were trespassing on sacred ground, and the residents were not happy about it. "This is creepy," Tom whispered, his voice barely audible. "Let's just go." "Don't be a baby," Ryan scoffed, but his bravado sounded hollow. He walked toward the massive oak in the center. I'm gonna do it." He reached out and placed his hand flat against the rough bark of the leader's tree. For a second, nothing happened. Then, a low groaning sound echoed through the clearing, seeming to come from the tree itself. A gust of wind suddenly tore through the grove, kicking up dust and leaves, though the air outside the circle of oaks remained perfectly still. Ryan snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned. At that exact moment, all three of our cheap digital watches beeped and went blank, their screens dead. We didn't need any more convincing. We sprinted back to the truck, piled in, and Ryan slammed it into reverse. As we tore out of there, I looked back at the grove. Standing under the center tree, I saw a figure. It was tall and unnaturally thin, a silhouette against the moonlight. It just stood there, watching us leave. We didn't stop driving until we hit the main highway. We were all shaken, trying to laugh it off as our nerves getting the better of us. The next day, Ryan called me, his voice frantic. The hand he had placed on the tree was swollen and red, and a strange branching pattern, like the veins of a leaf, was spreading up his arm. The doctors couldn't explain it. They treated it as a severe allergic reaction, but none of the treatments worked. The pattern kept spreading. A week later, Tom and I went to visit him. He was weak, confined to his bed. The strange, dark veins had spread across his chest. He told us that every night since we went to the grove, he'd had the same dream. He's standing in the clearing, and the tall, thin figure is there. The figure doesn't speak, but Tom said he can hear its voice in his head, saying the same thing over and over. "You took a part of me. Now I'm taking a part of you." 2 weeks after our trip to Apostles Grove, Ryan died. The official cause of death was a sudden aggressive infection of unknown origin. Tom and I knew the truth. We never went back to the grove, and we never spoke of that night again. But sometimes, when the wind blows a certain way, I can almost hear a low groan coming from the deep woods, and I know the guardian of that forgotten graveyard is still waiting. My first apartment after college was in a massive pre-war building in Chicago. It had character, high ceilings, hardwood floors that groaned with every step, and a rattling steam radiator that sounded like a blacksmith was trapped inside it. I loved it. It was my first real taste of independence. The building had its quirks. The elevator was ancient and temperamental, and there was always a faint, unidentifiable smell in the hallways, something like dust and old perfume. I lived on the 14th floor. There was no 13th floor button in the elevator. It went from 12 straight to 14. I worked late, so I often came home after midnight. The hallways at that hour were long, dim tunnels, and the silence was absolute. One night I stepped out of the elevator and saw him for the first time. He was standing at the far end of the hallway, near the emergency exit. He was just a silhouette in the dim light, a man in what looked like a long coat and a fedora, the kind you see in old movies. I felt a jolt of unease. It was late, and he was just standing there, motionless. I fumbled for my keys, my eyes fixed on him. I expected him to move to say something, but he just stood there. I unlocked my door, slipped inside, and deadbolted it behind me, my heart pounding. I told myself he was probably a neighbor waiting for someone. The next week, I saw him again. Same place, same pose. This time, I got a slightly better look at him. He was tall, and the coat he wore seemed too heavy for the season. I couldn't make out his face under the brim of the hat. Again, he didn't move. I hurried into my apartment, a cold knot of dread forming in my stomach. This became a regular occurrence. Almost every night I came home late, he would be there, a silent sentinel at the end of my hall. I never saw him arrive or leave. He was just there. I started to get genuinely scared. I mentioned it to my building superintendent, a gruff old man named Stan. He just grunted. "A lot of people in this building. Probably just someone from another floor." But I knew that wasn't it. There was something deeply unnatural about him. One night I was feeling brave, or maybe just foolish. I decided I was going to confront him. As I stepped out of the elevator, there he was. I took a deep breath and started walking toward him, my keys clenched in my fist. "Excuse me," I said, my voice sounding shaky even to me. "Can I help you?" He didn't respond. I took another step closer. I was about 20 feet away now. "Do you live on this floor?" Still nothing. I could feel the temperature in the hallway dropping. I was close enough now to see that his coat was black and threadbare, and there was something wrong with the space under his hat. It wasn't just shadow, it was complete featureless blackness. Panic overrode my bravery. I turned and practically ran to my apartment door. As I was jamming the key into the lock, I risked a glance over my shoulder. He was gone. The hallway was empty. I thought maybe that would be the end of it, that I had scared him off. But I was wrong. A few nights later, I woke up suddenly. The air in my bedroom was freezing cold. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. My bedroom door was open, and standing in the doorway was the man in the fedora. He was inside my apartment. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with terror. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, a black silhouette against the dim light of the living room. Then he slowly lifted a hand and tipped his hat. Underneath, where his face should have been, was nothing, just a swirling empty void. He took a step into my room, and then another. I finally found my voice and let out a scream that tore from my throat. As soon as the sound left my lips, he vanished. Just winked out of existence. I didn't sleep in that apartment again. I packed a bag and stayed with a friend until I could find a new place. I broke my lease and moved out a week later. On my last day, as I was carrying the final box to my car, I got in the elevator. As the doors were closing, I saw Stan, the superintendent, watching me from the end of the hall. He had a strange, sad look on his face. "You saw him, didn't you?" he said, his voice quiet. "The man who jumped from the roof back in '48? He never really left the 14th floor. The summer I was 17, my family went on a camping trip to a remote part of the Appalachian Mountains in Pennsylvania. Our campsite was near an old abandoned iron furnace, a massive stone structure slowly being reclaimed by the forest. It was a beautiful, eerie place. On our second night there, a thick fog rolled in, blanketing the entire area. You couldn't see more than 10 feet in any direction. My dad, ever the storyteller, decided it was the perfect atmosphere for a ghost story. He told us a local legend about the furnace. He said that during its operation in the 1800s, accidents were common. One night, a worker fell into the molten iron. They were never able to retrieve his body. The legend says his spirit still haunts the woods around the furnace, and that on foggy nights you can sometimes hear his screams. We all had a nervous laugh, and soon after, we headed to our tents for the night. I was sharing a tent with my younger brother, Leo. Sometime deep in the night, I was woken up by a sound. It was a low roar, a deep guttural noise that seemed to shake the very ground. It sounded animalistic, but unlike any animal I had ever heard. It was filled with rage and pain. Leo was awake too, his eyes wide in the darkness. "What was that?" he whispered. The roar came again, closer this time. It was so loud it hurt my ears. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I could hear my parents stirring in their tent next to ours. My dad called out, "What the hell was that?" Then we heard a tremendous crash like a massive tree falling. It sounded like it was right next to our tents. This was followed by another roar. This one so close it felt like it was right outside our thin nylon tent wall. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated fury. I was paralyzed with fear. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I expected my dad to come bursting out of his tent, but there was only silence from their direction. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then something slammed into the side of our house. It was a physical impact, hard enough to knock pictures off the walls and send a lamp crashing to the floor. It was a solid, meaty thud, followed by a splintering, cracking sound as the wooden siding gave way. This was no animal. This was something immensely powerful, and it was trying to get in. We heard a low, throaty growl that seemed to vibrate through the entire house. A sound that bypassed the ears and went straight to the primal fear center of the brain. The house itself seemed to groan under the strain. I couldn't scream. No sound would come out. I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting for the end. I must have blacked out from sheer terror. The next thing I remember is the sun shining through the tent walls. It was morning. The fog was gone. The world was quiet. I crept out of the tent, my whole body shaking. My dad and brother were already outside, their faces pale. My mom was standing by the remains of our campfire, staring at the back porch of the house. The wooden door that led into the house had been completely ripped from its hinges. It lay splintered on the porch floor. In the coat closet just inside, we found our big German shepherd, Champ, huddled in the farthest corner, lying in a puddle of his own urine, whimpering. He wouldn't come out for 2 days. My mom eventually told us that she had been awake the whole time. After the final roar, she heard heavy, bipedal footsteps circling the house, and then the sickening sound of the door being torn apart. She never saw what it was. We never went camping in those woods again. We never talked about what happened that night, but sometimes when I'm in a very quiet place, I can still feel the vibration of that roar in my bones. And I know that there are things in the deep, dark woods that are better left undisturbed. We all have those stories, the ones that make the hair on your arm stand up and a shiver trace its way down your spine. The ones that make you check the locks twice and leave a light on when you go to sleep. Maybe it was a whisper in an empty room, a shadow that moved on its own, or a feeling of being watched when you were certain you were alone. These experiences remind us that there's a thin veil between our world and something else. What you've just listened to are just a few of those moments, but the world is full of them. What's your story? Share your own unexplained encounters in the comments below. If these tales have left you with a chill, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more journeys into the unknown, and ring that notification bell so you never miss a chance to question what's real. Until next time, stay curious and try not to listen too closely to the silence.